I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure a few more people will chime in as we get going, but welcome to everybody tonight for our annual open house lecture. This is a lecture series we do every year featuring PhD students who are doing their research. We collect abstracts from students and the faculty select out of a group of several abstracts. And so Zach Selby is here tonight as one of the selected abstracts to give his lecture. And I'm going to hand the mic over to Ken Stone to give an introduction, and then we'll move ahead with Zach's lecture. Feel free to write questions in the chat if you have them.
Great. So thanks, Emily. I'm glad everyone here could join us for this conversation. And I'm very happy to hear from Dr. Zachary Selby, who recently defended his dissertation and completed his PhD with us. After also completing his MA at Vanderbilt, where he worked with my own PhD advisor. We were just discussing that with Rabbi Edwards. I've been very pleased to work with Zach at CTS, not just on his own work, but as a teaching assistant, both online and face-to-face, in our required and growing interpreting the Hebrew Bible course. And with respect to his topic for the afternoon, the primary thing I will note is that he has taken a very controversial question. And when I say controversial, I mean controversial for centuries among Christians, Jews, and secularists alike, and has tried to offer a new framework with which we can try to understand it today. The topic generally involves violence in books like Joshua, where Dr. Selby has focused a lot of his work. The framework, however, shifts our attention to economic and class issues. But I don't want to say more about his argument than that for now, because I want him to be able to summarize his own perspective, but I look forward to our Q&A after the lecture. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Selby.
Thank you, Ken. I'm going to share my PowerPoint real quick, just so that my face isn't the main thing you all have to look at the entire time, especially because I'm looking over down at the angle for my lecture text. But I'd like to thank CTS for offering me this opportunity to share some of my research. In particularly Emily, I looked at our email chain. I think it was about 35 emails we had back and forth trying to schedule this. It was delayed because of the pandemic. And so I also want to say to everyone who's here, I hope you're doing as well as we can be in these days. One last moment, I'd like to just sort of put this in memory of Ted Jennings. He hated aesthetics and he hated Marxist aesthetics particularly, but he loved his students and he loved what we did with what he taught us. So my dissertation was entitled The Historiographic Harem, Narrative Production, Class Ideology in the Deuteronomistic History. And that lays out as schematically as possible my focus in this text. I looked at the harem as an aspect of class struggle in post-monarchic Israelite society through the lens of narrative production, to show how its use focuses on legitimizing paradigms of economic and political centralization. And as Ken mentioned, the harem is it's a violent concept. You might not have been super familiar with the word before today, but you've inevitably heard of a harem tradition before. You might know the second half of this lyric that I sung in Sunday school. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. It's a cute song, very catchy, and it has a loose grip on the specifics of the text, but that's a harem tradition in there. So the Israelites are to completely eradicate the inhabitants of Jericho, to destroy the city itself and to slaughter the livestock found in it, and finally to sequester away all the non-killable parts of this city in the treasury of Yahweh. The non-killable parts being metallic wealth and other cultic implements. And though Jericho is probably the best known harem, it's actually a rare exception in the Deuteronomistic history because it's the only time a full harem is ordered. Most of the time, livestock are allowed to be reincorporated into the community, or the women and children are spared, is kidnapped, or other times it only applies to individuals. So you'll hear me refer to the harem rather than some sort of translation for it, because I think that most of the translations obscure more than they totally explicate the concept. So you might have seen things like utterly destroy or the ban or devoted to destruction in translation. And those get at very important aspects of the harem, but it doesn't really differentiate it from other destructive verbs in the Hebrew Bible. Now, my major thesis throughout the dissertation is that the harem concept in the Deuteronomistic history is primarily a distributive logic for structuring the post-monarchic political economy of the imperial province of Yehud, rather than a reference to a social practice related to the wholesale slaughter of enemy combatants. And similar to the ways in which contemporary political struggles sort of mobilize old motifs and tropes in order to apply to their contemporary situation, the use of the violent imagery in the concept of the harem is a form of politically and ideologically productive anachronism in the Deuteronomistic history. Robert Carroll's elucidation of the post-exilic myth of the empty lamb provides a point of entry into the ideological discourses of the Gola community, as the returning exiles from Babylon. So following these deportations, the land is represented as completely emptied of its inhabitants so that it might rest during the Sabbath and pay off its debt. But this exilic point of view requires a point of origin for those sons of the deportation to begin their Sabbath passivity. So the conquest narrative of Joshua seeks, and I think ultimately fails, to portray itself as a purification of the land through the eradication of its indigenous inhabitants. Instead, in the traditions we'll look at this afternoon about Gibeon and Rahab and Aiken, we see the ways in which non-Israelites are aesthetically integrated into class hierarchies. So in my readings, the ways in which this erasure of Canaan, and again, not the literal Canaanites, operates in the text is not through ethnic distinction, but along lines of class stratification. The basic class dichotomy in the political economy of ancient and classical Southwest Asian societies is an ebb and flow of a center populated by ruling class, non-laboring populations trying to extract wealth from productive agricultural margins. And the society of Yehud, after the rise of the empires in the 8th century BCE, is organized on a doubly extractive pattern. First, it has to be centralized to the domestic ruling class, and then again to the true imperial center. I argue that the harem ideology in Joshua labors in service of justifying these patterns of distribution that maximize centralization. So how do we approach this underlying class script then? Oh, you're supposed to see that about the harem before. It's not important. I used throughout my dissertation a framework developed by Frederick Jameson in the political unconscious. And he develops a method in there that's a tripartite level of interpretation. We're only looking at the second level here, so there's going to be a lot of perhaps questions about what's going on the other side. But this looks very similar to the classic Christian or patristic model of a 4-level interpretation, where there's the literal plot, there's a moral meaning, then there's an allegorical, prefigurative interpretation, and then finally an anagogical collective fate of humanity meaning to the text. But Jameson's not a patristic, quite obviously, and his concern doesn't lie with interpreting these texts as a matter of religious edification. Instead, Jameson foregrounds the aesthetic as a realm of political thought in its own right. Jamesonian interpretation asserts that the political in literature subsumes other interpretive methods. So it's not that every text is actually about the political, but that all texts and all aesthetics in general are political in themselves. Okay, so the narrative situation where Joshua begins is that of Israel not yet in the land. The Israelites have to take possession of this land, and that's the basic plot mechanism of Joshua, conquest and then allotment. J. Alberto Sagan notes in his commentary that the conquest is, quote, something very peaceful, like a cultic procession where one has nothing else to worry about. Now, perhaps Sagan's peacefulness is somewhat ironic given the amount of slaughter that's about to happen in these texts, but nevertheless, he reveals an important point about historiography, which is that the formal structure of historiography as a genre allows for the battles to be controlled, ordained by Yahweh, and decisively won by Israel. So what does the biblical harem have to do with social class? In the book of Joshua's conquest traditions, the differentiation seems to occur mainly between distinct ethnic entities, the Israelites and the Canaanites and the rest of the nations, not between something we would really call class identities. But as I'll hope to show in the next few minutes, there's a great deal of aesthetic labor being done on themes that one might categorize as class-based in the expansive harem narratives in Joshua. It's important to note that ethnicity, class, and gender are all intertwined in the Deuteronomistic history and how they go together to construct some notion of true Israel or Israelite identity. But what I hope to show here is the way that the harem particularly mediates class antagonisms from a point in time where the Canaanites are no longer the dominant players in the political apparatus governing the land. And so to approach this, we have to remember that literacy, and especially a literacy that's capable of writing and composing texts, is extremely limited in Israelite society. And these aesthetic laborers are predominantly, almost exclusively dependent on wealthy patrons or state sponsorship for the financing of their training. So already scribal activity is obtaining a class loyalty. In the words of Philip Davies, scribes, quote, absorb the culture of the regimes that they served. And this literary output is part of a strategy for reproducing those ideologies throughout society. And we'll talk some more about social class in just a moment, but one critical consequence of limited literacy is that one's class opponents, the ones from which the ruling class seeks to appropriate wealth, are not equal partners in class struggle as it manifests in literature, as it manifests in writing and representation. We live in a world after the Arab Spring when it was indexed by Twitter. And it's really hard, I think, for us to imagine the opacity in which the losers of historical struggles and revolutionary struggles languish as rabble rousers or ingrates or something like that. So in order to pursue these effaced class discourses, Jamesonian interpretation reframes the text as a symbolic move or stratagem in class struggle. Class ideology as it appears in literature is for Jameson the symbolic or formal resolution of concrete social contradictions. And so he builds on the linguistic concept of the seam as the basic unit of meaningfulness. And he comes up with this idea of the ideologium, which is the basic unit of ideological discourse, essentially. I like to think of the ideologium as sort of the kernel of a narrative logic or trajectory. It's the thing without which a text or an aesthetic object wouldn't be what it is. For the book of Joshua, that's the land itself. Without the land, there is no Joshua. Without conquest of the land, there is no Joshua. It's the ideological currency in which this class fantasy plays out. The land's also the ideological anchor around which the various binaries you might hear me talk about tonight, like Israelite and foreign or center and margin, are all structured. So we're inching closer to talking about biblical traditions, but there's one last insight we have to talk about from Marx, namely that social class is not a self-sufficient entity or some sort of sub-community that has an intrinsic quality to itself, but that class is a relational identity. And it's a relational identity in as much as class is always and only defined by its positions in relation to some other class opponent. Every text or tradition present in the Hebrew Bible is consciously or unconsciously an aspect of the ideological mechanisms by which any class is defined over and against their antagonists. The harem traditions of the Deuteronomistic history seem particularly receptive to this political contextualization because the way that it differentiates between those on the right and wrong side of its logic are overdetermined. There's an ethnic, cultic, spatial, political, economic lines, all of this stuff. So there seems to be something else going on in the harem, especially when it's written in these synchronic texts that are coming into form much later after the time of monarchic Israel, when they would have had the sort of sovereignty to actually carry out some sort of wholesale slaughter. So one thing empire really doesn't like is letting their provinces run wild with military force, because then it's more liable to rebellion and other sorts of disruptions of the circuits of expropriating wealth. So the basic form of class antagonism in the ancient world is this non-productive center appropriating the production of margins. The harem texts are only a part, and really just a small part, of the overall polemical strategy that seeks legitimation for the ruling class, both domestic and imperial, in a double form. It's both a remedy for promoting the human dignity and clear conscience of a given class, and also a means of discrediting their adversaries. So the forms that this neutralization of class opponents may take are myriad, but all these processes lead to a universalization of culture, where literary representation projects the image that there's only a single culture a unitary body of norms, traditions, and practices that are proper to a society. So if the Gola community, the returning exiles from Babylon, or at least the scribal laborers in their employment, are trying to construct a political myth about the conquest that seeks to redress their own loss of sovereignty in the post-exilic era, what sort of logics of class hierarchy can we find in the spatial themes of the harem? My chapter on this text was very long, as were all the rest of my chapters, and I apologize again to my committee members for putting them through reading all that. But I want to touch on just two of the moments that I think are most important. And the first one is the inauguration of class differentiation in Israel from the time of the classless wilderness community. In the Exodus, I'll talk a bit more about this before, but in the Exodus, there's no class because there's no sort of production that needs to occur. And then the second moment is the use of the harem as a mechanism for prioritizing centralization over ethnicity as an identity marker for Israel during the conquest. So these logics are on display in the Gibeonite tradition, as well as Rahab and Aiken's sort of substitution that I'm going to get at. And there's definitely a great deal of detail I'm going to have to leave out. So I'll try and emphasize the major moments, and I would love to hear any questions about specific aspects of the text if you have them. So the Gibeonites tale is found in chapter 9 of Joshua, but in my class-centric reading of the tale, it really begins at the end of Joshua 5. So after crossing the Jordan, the inauguration of the conquest is marked by the erection of monuments, the circumcision of male Israelites, and the celebration of Passover. In short, the Israelite camp becomes a roving band of sanctified conquerors. There are two food motifs that are noteworthy here. First, the cessation of the manna, and second, the eating of the produce of the land. In the narration of conquest, both biblical and otherwise, food and its production and distribution is rarely given much attention. That's poor people's work. That's not the sort of work that history writers are concerned with. But in these two scenes in Joshua, the representation of these motifs begin to integrate the Israelite camp into the social order of Canaan, into this land that's flowing with milk and honey. So the political economy of the manna period relies on a closed circuit of provisioning by Yahweh. There's no hard labor, there's no agricultural production. But in coming to the land and crossing over out of this classless community, the realities of production and distribution reappear in the conquest tradition. The celebration of Passover is actually really rare in the Deuteronomistic history as well. It occurs only here in Joshua and in 2 Kings 23 with Josiah's celebration. So the inaugural consumption of the produce of the land following the Passover precedes any conquest, even as it presumes a sort of zone of control from which the Israelites are able to draw this food. And Joshua's address at the end of the book in 24:13 offers a retrospective image of this miraculous and immediate control. Joshua says, "I have given you a land on which you did not toil, from vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant, you eat." And there are a number of other places where food is associated with the harem. During the Neo-Assyrian siege of Jerusalem, the Neo-Assyrian envoy basically tells the Jerusalemites that they're going to have to eat their own dung and drink their own urine. But if they acquiesce to the Neo-Assyrians, they'll resettle them in a land of grain and fresh wine, of bread and vineyards, of olive trees and honey. So food as a means of sustenance is at work in the political valences of the literary harem. And following the expansion of the Israelite reputation among the kings of Canaan, food again becomes a motif through which class delineations are articulated. So the Gibeonites, some of you might know their tale, they come to Israel and they are sporting worn out sandals and mended wineskins, and they have dry and moldy bread. And this is sometimes portrayed as a deception, but it's really just a clever sort of self-subordination. And this image of wearing worn out sandals is contrasting with Deuteronomy 8:4 and 29:4, where the Israelites are said to wear eternal sandals that never wear out. So in concert with the provisioning of the manna, the wandering Israelite camp is entirely removed from basic class antagonism. In the context of the Deuteronomic war legislation in Deuteronomy 20, where it evokes the harem, the Gibeonites seem to be aware of this law in some way or another. So they position themselves as coming from a far off city. And apparently this dry and moldy bread is all the proof that Joshua needs that they really are from far off. They don't have to be utterly destroyed. we can make a covenant with them. And so there's an interesting moment in the text where this dry and moldy bread suddenly becomes appealing to the Israelite council, and they start eating with them immediately after this covenant is formed. But when the Israelites discover that the envoys from a far off land are actually living in the midst of Israel's possession, don't forget Gibeon is just north of Jerusalem. And this becomes a big source of distress for the Israelites. The revelation of this deception inverts the Gibeonite explanation to Joshua for their reasons for coming to the bargaining table in the first place. Gibeon hears from afar what the Israelites are doing, and then the Israelites hear that the Gibeonites are living nearby. These are sort of Karev and I can't remember the other Hebrew preposition right now. I should have written it down, but they're set up in dichotomy quite often throughout the book of Joshua. We'll see it again, Karev with Rahab. So to resolve this emerging tension, the Gibeonites are placed in subordination to the Israelite population. Joshua curses them. Now you are accursed. Those who come from you will never cease to be slaves, woodcutters and water drawers for the house of God. And there's significance given to these vocations, inasmuch as their productivity is redirected from the local sanctuary to the house of God in the place which he will choose. And so there's been archaeological excavations at Gibeon that reveal its importance as an agricultural producer for nearby Jerusalem. And during the Neo-Assyrian period, it was involved in industrial olive oil production. But there's also in the Deuteronomistic history, Solomon himself offers 1,000 burnt offerings at the high place of Gibeon. And this is where he receives his dream, where he is able to start gaining wisdom and these various other sort of miraculous king-like traits. So this goal of explaining why the Gibeonites are still allowed to be connected with the Yahweh cult, it's accomplished by way of inaugurating a class strata to differentiate between Israelites and the Gibeonites. The congregation is to be served by the menial and persistent labor of the indigenous populations. So beginning with some moldy pieces of bread, the narrative trajectory reveals an exception to the class fantasy of a wholly emptied land by subjugating the Gibeonites and redirecting the flows of their productivity from the Gibeonite margin to the not yet available center in Jerusalem. So chapter 10 also continues to highlight how the Gibeonites are characterized by weakness. They have these moldy bread and holy sandals, and then they become slaves to the Yahweh temple. And then they are described as having mighty warriors, which precipitates a coalition of kings to come against Israel. But the text doesn't allow these mighty warriors to fight on behalf of their suzerain. Instead, Yahweh sends a hailstorm, which kills more combatants than anyone else by swords or anything like that. The Gibeonite position within the newly forged Israelite state is subordinated to the overpowering center of Yahweh in Joshua's divine warfare. The Gibeonites will remain in the land, but only as an underclass, performing menial labor in service of Israel's cult. And this exception to the harem, where the land is supposed to be totally emptied of Canaanites, doesn't produce any disaster, like it seems to, like it's foreshadowed to in the beginning of Joshua or places in Deuteronomy. Instead, Israel's position as a regional power is strengthened by this subordination of the Gibeonites. Okay, I'm checking my time. So we're going to move on to Rahab and Aiken, and we'll try and circle back around to the Gibeonites and all of this and give some final thoughts. I wonder if we'll get there. But the literary representation of Rahab provides a negative impression to Aiken's resistance to the harem. And so Rahab's tale is quite well known, so I don't think I have to go back over that, but Aiken's is a little bit more obscure. So I'm just going to give a brief overview, but Aiken's tale is in Joshua 7. At the start of Joshua 7, we learn that someone violated this harem command at Jericho. The narrator comes in, tells us that Aiken did it, and then the story goes on. Joshua makes preparations for battle. They go to Ai. They lose at Ai. It's the only recorded defeat of Israel in the entire conquest tradition. In the narrated traditions. And then they come back. There's a long roll call ceremony where the tribes are brought by tribe and then family by family. And eventually Aiken is singled out as the one who has violated the harem. Eventually then he goes and they remove him from the camp. They take him to a valley. They stone him and burn him and his family. They erect a monument, and Joshua offers a pun-based etymology for the valley's name, which is Achor. which means trouble, troubler, Aiken to Acor. And Aiken is actually misremembered in First Chronicles by this pun name. They call him Acor. So the portrayal of Rahab as an element outside of Israel is reinforced in a number of places in the account of Jericho. Namely, her home in the wall connects her with the major impediment for Israel's conquest of the land. And this focus on walled and non-walled settlements is characteristic of Joshua. Israelites are not associated with settlements until they're done with the conquest. Likewise, the Canaanites are exclusively associated with settlements. So the spies come up to Rahab's abode, and she hides them from the king's people. And sorry about that. And then as the 7th cycle of Israel's parade around Jericho is coming to a close, Joshua issues the Harim command of the city, and also an exception to this command, namely to bring Rahab, her mother and father, and all that which was hers out of it. He commissions the 2 spies themselves to go retrieve Rahab. And at this point, she's still marked as exterior to Israel. She's brought to the edge of the camp, to the Minchutz. But her movement is completed in 625, when she is said to have lived in the midst of Israel, Bekarev, to this day. So earlier in Rahab's tale, we all know that she approaches them to make a deal for the security of her family. And she apparently, her rationale for this is that she knows that Yahweh is going to give the land to the Israelites anyways. And she repeats some tropes that we see throughout, that other people hear of what the Israelites are doing and their hearts melt and they're unable to stand before the Israelites. And her actions precipitating the Harim of Jericho steadily move herself and her family into the safety of Israel. She transforms from an element outside of Israel to an exteriority that's living inside of Israel. But there's a lot more political work occurring under the surface of Rahab's deal making. Musa Dube offers a really insightful reading on Rahab's relation to the imperial colonizing conquest of the Israelites. And this is a longer quote from her, but she says, Rahab's voice is notably one with the colonizer. As a literary creation of the colonizer's pen, she is the mouthpiece of their agendas. The colonizer's ideal dream is that the colonized will proclaim the colonizer's superiority, pledge absolute loyalty, and surrender all their rights voluntarily. Rahab's story contains the somewhat hidden agenda of the colonizer that proceeds by characterizing the colonized as people who require and beseech their own domination. Now, Dube's understanding of Rahab as a dream woman for the conquering imagination is intensified by the chronology of Rahab's plot. Rahab's treason against Jericho occurs before she has forged a covenant with the spies. Rahab's exemption from the harem requires her preemptive loyalty to Israel. And by committing herself to Israel and affirming their right to possess the land, she has become an integral part of the Israelite conquest as a whole. Now, in contrast to Rahab, who's quite active in the text, Aiken is rather passive, especially for someone on the brink of execution. So as I mentioned earlier, in 7:1, we get this voice from the narrator that says that Aiken is the source of harem within the camp. But Yahweh's words to Joshua in 7:11 employ 7 active verbs. Someone has sinned, violated, taken, stolen, deceived, brought the harem into the camp. So Aiken's violation makes him quite busy from a grammatical perspective. But after Aiken is discovered to be the perpetrator, Joshua asks him to make confession. And Aiken's reply is comically compliant. He says, "Truly I have sinned against Yahweh, the God of Israel. I did such and such. When I saw in the spoil a fine cloak from Shinar and 200 shekels of silver and a tongue of gold weighing 50 shekels, I desired them and I took them. Behold, they are hidden in the earth in my tent with the silver underneath." And so these sort of speech forms, we see Rahab's in Joshua 2 and Aiken's in 7:20. These sort of speech forms are an example of the process that Jameson calls cultural universalization. The Deuteronomistic history relies on these speeches to provide sort of summative moments and to reproduce the ideology of the authors. But I reframe these not as what Martin Note called a simple and unified theological interpretation of history. I think they're integral moments in the expansion of a ruling class ideology onto literary avatars of class opponents. Essentially, these speeches give the text the opportunity to say, look, even Rahab and Aiken say the same things that I'm saying. And so despite Aiken's reticence to offer a plea for mercy or an explicit defense, there still remains a degree of resistance in Aiken's words. This confession is the moment when the text has a chance to close its circuits, to really make it clear that Aiken is responsible, but we don't get that confession. Aiken's confession refers what he saw in the plunder, not from the devoted things or the harem. This is from the shalal. And this is a distinction that is prevalent in all of the monarchic literature. And notably, David has no harem tradition ever associated with him, even when there's a chance to make him fulfill something that Saul could not, a reason why Saul lost the kingship. David is all about distributing through shalal. So it's a very interesting sort of absence in the textual logic of the Deuteronomistic history. So Aiken confesses not to the crime of stealing from the harem, but to the custom of dividing the spoil of fallen cities among the individuals who fought to conquer them. Aiken appeals to an alternative conception of the relations of production where the goods of the conquered are distributed amongst communities rather than centralized in Yahweh's treasury. Aiken's actions disrupt the organization of the literary community, specifically the economic totality of the harem. And Aiken and Rahab's connection is further reinforced by their parallel descriptions. The impetus for both of their movements is hiding, whether hiding the spies or Aiken's stashing of gold and silver. And the scope is similar as well. Rahab, her family, and all which was hers are those who are brought into Israel. Aiken, his family, and all which was his are those that are taken to the valley and stoned and burned in sort of foisted outside of the community. And so given Aiken's residence within the camp at the start of this narrative, we can just assume Aiken's interiority to Israel. And similarly, his execution locates him firmly outside of the camp in this valley of trouble. So Aiken's movement is the opposite of Rahab's. As Rahab comes into Israel, so Aiken must be removed. On the one hand, an exteriority interiorized, and on the other, an interiority exteriorized. These same spatial movements are occurring in the Gibeonite tale when the Gibeonites come to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal. Who is allowed to remain in the camp is an index for who becomes a part of Israel after the conquest. So put schematically like this, Joshua 2-7 sort of highlights the centrality of support for the institution of the harem over ethnic identification as Israelite as the markers of inclusion within the camp. Without this particular distributed model of the harem, the presence of Yahweh retreats. But this dynamic between Aiken and Rahab turns on the identity and difference that distinguishes them. Rahab's identity as foreigner, exterior, other, is of no concern to the biblical authors and redactors because she follows the command. While the biblical texts are no strangers to condemning Israelites for their misdeeds, Aiken's identity as an Israelite does nothing to secure his survival without adherence to the harem command. And so I think that this substitution between Rahab and Aiken reveals an unconscious dimension to the text, which is that in the text meaning the harem traditions, which is that the harem seeks the removal of these foreign elements in the land as foreign. It seeks the negation of Rahab's foreignness, not the negation of Rahab. So harem laws in Levitical legislation might originally have aimed at some sort of intra-Israelite distribution, but in these texts of Joshua, the harem functions as a mechanism of securing the incorporation of a foreign body through neutralization of what is foreign about that body. The desire of the harem is to incorporate the foreign into Israel by virtue of directing their economic production towards the political center, both past and future. And this is a Gustave Doré engraving of the Stoning of Aiken. I know that it's going to be hard to see, but it's kind of an odd addition to his library of inscriptions on the biblical text because he doesn't do a lot of Joshua stuff, but he picked up on the Stoning of Aiken for some reason. I like to show this because it was kind of a cool inscription, really. Okay. So at the opening of the Communist Manifesto, the first line is the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. And appended to this axiom of class struggle, there's a small note, probably penned by Engels, that says that is all written history. And quite central to Jameson's project, and especially of dialectical and the Marxist tradition about thinking of history in general, is that history is not a text, not a narrative, but is only available to us through processes of narrativization. History is a cacophony of events that someone somewhere has to make sense of. And that history is not a text is a Jameson quote. I did not want to attribute that to me. He came up with that definitely. But historiography is the writing not of history itself, but of why what happened had to happen that way. And those who control the means of literary production, which includes control of literary distribution through mechanisms such as censorship, editorial softening, overriding. The Deuteronomistic history is extremely composite text, so we're seeing layers and layers of accretions, but yet none of these harem traditions were ever thought to be taken out. They still exist and they persist in their meaningfulness. So the unconscious of Joshua's historiography takes on a double form. First is a mimicry of the overwhelming and irresistible force of imperial militaries, which it sort of transmutes into Yahweh's martial presence. The idea being that if Yahweh is on the Israelites' side, no one can befall them or resist them. In the same way that the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian armies would have been experienced by these sort of petty monarchies in the Levant. And the second way that this unconscious manifests is that the desire for non-resistance to the conquest becomes a human responsibility to accelerate the centralization of Israel around a single locus of political religious authority. In the context of Yehud, the territory of Yehud is much smaller than Judah, Israel, the United Kingdoms and all that, but it's very much centered on Jerusalem as its main central city. One of the things that one of my teachers, Doug Knight, writes in a book is that cities in the ancient world are containers of power. They are the place in which authority and sovereignty resides, in as much as the 70 to 100 person village communes can't resist their overwhelming force. So the paradigmatic class gestures in Joshua appear in these alternative subterranean plot lines focusing on the interactions of Israelites and Canaanites during the conquest. If you've read Joshua recently, you'll see that the bulk of the conquered territory, essentially everything that's not Benjaminite territory, is presented schematically as a simple listing of conquered kings and their cities. The king of Jericho, 1. The king of everywhere, 1. And so there's this odd imbalance in terms of the narrative fullness of the harem traditions against the sort of conceptual ideal of the harem as a total emptying of the land. So although there are potentially quite archaic traditions found within the book of Joshua, this book retools these traditions for a contemporary political goal of rearticulating the right of land possession, or more appropriately, land repossession, by returning elite Judahites in the new Persian province of Yehud. The regime of production that prevails under imperial administration remains that of an expropriative pattern where the agricultural margins have their production taken away from them. In the meantime, while the Babylonian diaspora has been going on, it's only the faces of the centralizers that have changed. Life has gone on for the agricultural communities, much as it went on while the Judahite monarchy was there, while the Jerusalem temple hadn't been emptied of its officiants and its priests. But this position that the returning exiles are coming back to is not one of direct political authority. They must, to be certain, pass along the expropriation to the true centers of power, whether coinage to the imperial treasuries or in-kind tributes to provision armies or regional satraps. So the ideologemic discourse about the land in the book of Joshua is not so much about reviving a historical reality of full Israelite possession, but controlling who is to be counted among those who receives the expropriated excess from the produce of the land. The book of Joshua encodes this class antagonism in the form of imperial conquest and despoilment of indigenous populations, the overwhelming force and efficacy of which is most closely paralleled in the Semitic cultures by the concept of harem, a sort of total unstoppable force of destruction. And so we're coming up on time, and there's just one last thing that I want to talk about, and that's the center margin binary in Joshua. And I've been trying to trace it along lines of a certain plasticity of ethnicity. Rahab is decidedly not Israelite, yet she's brought in. She's remembered, I think she's remembered as the wife of Joshua in the Talmud, and she's ancestor of great prophets. And so the Canaanites and Amorites are formally excluded from the possibility of possessing the land because of this ethnic differentiation. But this distinction is not as clear-cut as we might expect, given the examples of Rahab, Aiken, the Gibeonites. And even then in the allotment traditions, we see that the conquest is only partially fulfilled ever. And then we have the testimony of Judges as well, where we get back after the conquest and the Canaanites are still in the land. And this isn't to be some sort of hermeneutic gotcha for the biblical text. These are long-standing traditions that are part of negotiating ideology and the notion of what counts as Israelite and what sort of norms will secure protection from the trauma of imperial destruction again. But the major spatial logic of the Harem in the book of Joshua is to assert that what is foreign should not be central and what is marginal should not be Israelite. Spatially, this anxiety about the constitution of a true Israel and Yehud derives from the contradictions inherent in the singularity of the exile's class consciousness. Everyone who is exiled is an elite urban dwelling class. And it's related to the always forgotten laboring classes who continued on laboring despite the absence of the official representatives of the Judahite monarchy or the Yahwistic cult. And as we're coming up on about 15 minutes left, I can stop there. I have other things if you're interested in imperial political economy. I know that there's a few of us perhaps who are, but at this time, yeah, I will kind of just cut it there.
Thanks, Dr. Selby. I'm going to ask you a quick question and then let other folks follow up if they want to, because I've had opportunities to speak with you before. But as I mentioned at the beginning, you've been my TA before. So you've chosen a fairly technical topic in biblical studies, and you've interpreted it with another fairly technical theoretical framework, right? So I'm curious to hear you say a word, since you've also interacted with seminary students on a regular basis, about how you would, in maybe 1 minute, summarize the relevance of lining these things up for students who are approaching the Bible as part of a text that they're using in their ongoing work.
I think that there are two things. So if I can get 2 minutes that I can do this on. The first one being that one of the things that we have to realize whenever we're talking about texts like this is that they continue to mean beyond this moment of interpretation where I'm talking about the Harem as a class-based analytic. Joshua means something entirely different for a lot of other communities. But by focusing on the ways in which we can historicize a particular moment of interpretation, it's a useful, I think, analytic for seminary students to come to terms with a provisionality of meaning based on the communities in which they're participating. Basically saying that if you're in a community of indigenous Americans, you probably shouldn't preach from Joshua. This is the thing, the Robert Allen Warrior, really great essay about Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians, I think is what it's called, where we think about the Exodus as this great liberation event, which it is. But for the indigenous populations, the Exodus has a necessary consequence, which is their eradication in Canaan. So I think something like that is important. But the secondary, they're really related, importance is these texts also continue to mean the same thing. We've talked about this before, Ken and I, but I'm from Oklahoma, and the land run in Oklahoma is probably maybe the closest thing to this biblical paradigm that's occurred in the United States, with the exception of the initial driving of First Nations people westward from the East Coast in particular. So it is a way to I think, expose students to the long history of how these texts have meant, and to sort of reinvigorate why historical study is important in addition to confessional use and confessional relevance in that regard. I'm gonna ramble now, but it's one thing that you see it in houses. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It's from Joshua. And what that is signing you up for is going in and killing a whole bunch of Canaanites on the surface. And so it's something that that's really a meme about it, but it hits on something deeper about American political consciousness and the way that white America especially conceptualizes those from whom we expropriate wealth. And I'll leave it there. I was going to talk about David Harvey for a second, but maybe for the after hours.
Other folks, other questions?
Well, so it seems like this methodology, this method of reading the text serves to complicate it a lot, right? And not to undermine someone's, I don't know whether to call it fundamentalist, or I would say sort of simplistic reading of this particular text in isolation from other texts, and to say, well, what the text says or seems to be saying is a narrative construction of overlaid on a much more complicated historical process, and that some of these other tools of analysis can help us peel back some of the layers to see what's going on.
Yeah, and Jameson has a really interesting line about it, which is why he's describing it in one of his books about why he turns to aesthetics so early in his career. One, he did a philosophy PhD, so of course he's going to, but he turns to it because texts as like the book of Joshua, we talk about that. And as you do textual criticism and look at manuscripts, you know that there is no book of Joshua. There's an agreed upon synchronic form now, but the text was always negotiated. But the illusion of one singular text, the notion of a singular text gives the illusion of a closed arena in which sort of dialectical thinking can be intensified. It's hard to think about the whole world. It's hard to write a short dissertation about imperial political economy and narrative production and the ideology of 3 different books of text. But if we narrow it down to this sort of thing that has limits around it, you can display mechanisms of ideology, of thinking, of interpellation by sort of forming ideological subjects on a much easier scale to that regard. So I do think that it is yeah, a way of complicating without just disregarding, because those simplistic, not just literalist, but like a literal interpretation of Joshua is hard to reconcile with sort of the intricacies of the text. Sorry, you got me thinking, so I just kind of trailed off there. But we have one in the chat from Dean Crowder, which I'll just tell a little story about Dean Crowder. She was my undergrad advisor at Belmont, actually, which is a very nice circle. She writes, in your conversation about the Gibeonites, I was reminded of the story of Rizpah. Here, the Gibeonites require of David life for life because Saul killed some of them, disregarding the oath. Rizpah is a mother who guards 7 dead bodies as a result of the Gibeonites' demand. More of a comment on how this made me think of womanist maternal thought. Thank you, Dr. Selby. It's still really weird to see. Yes, I haven't read that recently, so I'm trying to remember. Maybe I'll try and pull this up. But there is another interesting sort of intertextuality with the harem. And it's the one harem that occurs in the book of Judges, where the Levite's concubine saga unfolds and they go to a civil war against Benjamin and they try to eradicate them. And the harem gets used in the end of it to punish these people, the Jabesh Gileadites, who don't show up against Benjamin. And Jabesh Gileadites they're mentioned 6 or 7 times, I think, in the whole Deuteronomistic history, but they're always allies of Saul. And they get haremed, and then they show up again in Samuel and all of this. But the Jabesh Gileadites are the ones who take Saul's body off of the Philistine walls, him and his sons. But so it's an interesting way that the harem always gets redeployed against Saul, never against David. It's a very interesting sort of recurrence. Sorry, I'm looking up Rizpah real quick. In the harem traditions themselves. Thank you for that comment, Dr. Crowder. Dean Crowder.
Another quick question then, Dr. Selby, based in part on what you just said. Do you think with your reliance upon Jameson and Marxism and so forth, there is any danger of overusing the economic and class issues and downplaying the issues of ethnicity and so forth?
Yeah, definitely so. And one of the reasons why I didn't actually say this, I wrote it in the lecture, but one of the reasons why I felt comfortable doing it and focusing on the economics was because there's people who have gone before me who have written about ethnicity and violence in the Hebrew Bible with much greater expertise than me. I'm thinking particularly of Gail Yee because she uses other Jamesonian methods. She does Jamesonian criticism too, and she just chooses to focus in different places. That's a little bit reductive of Gail Yee's work. She does a lot of everything in all of her books. So in that regard, but I think that is the reason I wanted to focus on class in particular was because of my experience with Joshua 7. So I started reading Joshua 7 in an exegesis seminar with Doug Knight at Vanderbilt, where we read the same text 14 weeks in a row and do all the various methods to it. You sit there and you go to class and you talk about the same stuff over and over again. And one of the things I was always really curious about was in the Jericho tradition, this line about all the metal goes to the treasury of Yahweh. That's not present almost anywhere else in the Harem. And the one, there's like 3 people who have done monographs on the Harem. A guy named Breckelmans is his last name, a Dutch scholar, reads this passage and just is like, this is totally unhinged. Like, I don't know where it came from. They've forgotten what the Harem is in this point. And the text picks that up so fast with Aiken. And Aiken comes back in Joshua 22 as a sort of memorial against using the Transjordan tribes. And they use his sort of fate that he did this economic treachery and that caused us almost to be eradicated. You all are doing something even worse by sort of constructing your own altar and sort of dissociating from the Jerusalem temple. So that's the kernel of mine. But I do think that there, especially for teaching, there is a way of overemphasizing the economic because that's not what's entirely the currency of whether we're training pastors or nonprofit leaders or just good citizens of the world. That's not always what people are thinking about. And that's definitely not what a lived oppression and exploitation is felt through always. So I do think there's some emphasis on it. Politically for myself, I don't think it's possible to overemphasize the economic, but that's my own political affiliation in that regard, I think.
Fair answer. Anyone else?
Well, you mentioned Saul, and that, of course, gets him in trouble in Samuel. Right.
So yeah, Saul loses the kingship about 100 times, but the one that does him in the end is a harem tradition. He fails to fully harem the Amalekites. And what I was talking about with David is at the end of 1 Samuel, or maybe it's that 1 Samuel 31, 2 Samuel 1. David comes across the Amalekite sort of courier, and he has a chance to really sort of put them to harem. And the text decides not to do it. Instead, they go across the caravan that's been raiding Philistine territory too, and they redistribute the shalal. And it's something that I don't know what to say about it. But yeah, Saul's case is very interesting. In my chapter on, it's not a chapter on Saul, but in my section on Saul, the harem really characterizes Saul as the anti-king. He's too anthropolitically powerful. He doesn't subordinate himself to the theopolitical apparatus of cult centralization in terms of bringing everything back to Jerusalem. Even as in just the previous chapter, in 1 Samuel 14, he's the one that stops everybody from preventing cultic misdeeds. They're trying to eat all of the animals with the blood still in them. And he says no and establishes an ad hoc altar and drains the blood and Samuel praises him for it. And so there's just this the Saul chapters are ambivalent, schizophrenic in some regard. They don't know what they want to do with Saul, so they have to kill him and take him away from the kingship quite a lot.
So I can confirm something that Dr. Selby said a moment ago, which is that he has a long dissertation, but it's also very well written, and I believe will soon be available in our library. So I encourage everyone to read it if you want to pursue this further. Dr. Vogt, I'll turn it back over to you.
I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight and to thank Dr. Selby for his excellent talk. It's great to hear your wisdom now that you're at the tail end of your time in our PhD program. We're so proud of what you've accomplished. Just, it's wonderful. So thank you so much to you and to everyone. And I will say good night and hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.